It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster.
I don't want to let people down. I've always had that fear. That's what spurs me on.
Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner, one of the BBC's 100 women, talks to me after what's been a tricky first 5 months in government. She says councils will have to deliver on Labour's plans to build 1.5 million new homes in England.
We are saying that they're mandatory targets and we want mandatory plans.
And says her friend, the former Transport Secretary Louise Haigh, should keep her £17,000 severance pay.
If it's what is the rules and what's said that they're accepting, then I don't see why she shouldn't.
Also on today's programme...
It clearly hasn't worked. The system is broken and we desperately need to fix it.
The new Transport Secretary brings 3 more railway companies into public ownership. Will nationalisation deliver better services? And Kemi Badenoch takes on Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Questions. We'll bring you that live at noon. Joining us today, Labour MP Mark Ferguson, Conservative MP Esther McVeigh, economist and former Labour and then independent candidate Faiza Shaheen, and columnist and broadcaster Emily Sheffield. This is Politics Live. Let's start with this headline in the Financial Times. South Western Railway set to be first train operator nationalised by Labour. There will be, in fact, 3 rail operators renationalised next year after a bill was passed into law, starting with South Western Railways. My opening question to the panel, starting with you, Mark, is will nationalisation improve railway services?
I believe that it will. Look, this isn't an ideological decision. It's a pragmatic one based on, let's be honest, the systematic failure of the current privatisation model within the train service. I think bringing everything together under one system is going to deliver better outcomes for passengers.
It hasn't for Northern Rail, has it? The Greater Manchester Mayor, Andy Burnham, who's Labour, has said the service from Northern is embarrassing, and that is in public ownership or public control.
We have a lot of challenges with a lot of rail companies at the moment, but LNER is currently under public control. I, like a lot of MPs, have to use that every week, and I am seeing incremental improvements over recent months.
Esther, will nationalisation improve railway services?
Not without modernisation and reform, and I don't see those on the schedule for Labour whatsoever. They collapse to the union paymasters, giving a pay increase to drivers with no reform. And what I will say, look, my granddad worked on the railways from the age of 12, carrying bags at Lime Street Station right the way through to the age of 68. I was the chair of the British Transport Authority. And what we need is that modernisation, which isn't going to be there.
Did privatisation deliver modernisation? What, and the service was...
Hang on a sec. Absolutely it did. And we cannot look back to British Rail with rose-tinted spectacles. It was the butt of every comedian's joke. It was the 1990s through the privatisation that saw the passenger numbers surge.
All right.
What we're seeing from Labour here now is increased debt to the taxpayer as they take over those contracts, all of the pension pots, all of the contracts, and equally the setting up 2 new quangos.
Well,
we are not going to get without reform.
Let Mark respond before I ask the other
This
guest.
is specifically being done in a way to minimise the impact on the taxpayer, which is why we're bringing in the train operating companies as those contracts expire. But privatisation has been an abject failure, and I'm sorry, Esther, if this is what your party's approach to opposition is going to be like, not accepting the failures under your government, then you're going to be in opposition for a long time.
Absolutely it does. And since COVID and lockdown, there has been, as you say, people want lower fares and they also want reliability. And I'm afraid it will not happen. It isn't 14.
Let me ask the other guest. Do you think it will deliver better services, a better experience for customers?
Well, possibly, but I think Labour will need to be confident in how it invests. And I think, absolutely, it's been a complete disaster. Privatisation has been a complete disaster for people using those trains. But I think also, this isn't, I think when we talk about public ownership, we're acting like this is all going to be publicly owned now. These are not the rolling stock companies. So there are still ways in which privatisation is playing through and can still cost the government and the taxpayer a lot of money because the actual carriages in which we use are not publicly owned.
So you'd like it to go further?
Yeah, I think we need to be really confident. I don't think you can do this in halfway measures.
Right. Do you think it'll make it cheaper? Cheaper fares?
There's no proof that it's going to make it cheaper fares. Everyone at the moment is looking at this and saying, no, it's not. I mean, that the Labour government themselves have not said it's going to make cheaper fares. So, and I think Labour are setting themselves up for a real problem here, is once they renationalise them, and that's coming very soon, they are going to have to own to the public every single late train. And at the same time, the public are going to think, I'm on the hook for this as a taxpayer. And I think it's going to be really problematic for Labour, because they are going to have to prove by the next election that they have delivered. But people, I'd be amazed if they can deliver on the railways in just 4 years, and they are going to be on the hook for it. And
but what would you do as an alternative if you accept that privatisation has been a failure, and there have been examples where it has completely failed? What would you do instead?
I think you've got to really look at how we've got to drive through more modernisation, and they've got to look at how you build the infrastructure. And I think Labour have got to come forward and say, how are they paying for this? Where's your investment coming from if it's not coming from private bodies?
Mark?
It can't just come from the taxpayer.
I've heard modernisation from two of the panellists, but no indication of what that modernisation is. Labour has a plan, and look, politics is about making decisions, having a plan, and then driving that plan through.
But what is the plan? No one knows.
The plan is what you disagree with, which is bringing the train operating companies back into public ownership.
But what's behind that?
I am happy for Labour to be judged on that record over the course of the next 5 years, because that is what politics is about. It's about delivering for people and standing on your record, and I'm happy to do that.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about delivery and promises. But first, have a look at these two headlines, starting first of all with The Telegraph. British Steel faces nationalisation under government plans, and from The Guardian, ministers considering renationalising British Steel if rescue plan fails. I should add at this point that we have a response from the business department playing down the likelihood of nationalisation, saying we have no plans to nationalise British Steel, but should they?
Well, I think one of the arguments that is made, obviously, is the job loss, what it means for those communities, and then the expense of what you do there in response to that community being massively diminished in terms of its economic prosperity. But also some of the arguments that unions make is around steel being a kind of foundational industry. You need it to do other things in the country. And so that's the argument as to why we need to keep some steel production in this country.
Would you be in favour of nationalising or renationalising steel?
I think we've got to take a pragmatic approach in terms of what is the best use of, let's be honest, relatively limited public money. Steel is incredibly important in terms of if you want to build up 1.5 million homes, which I'm sure we might want to talk about later. If you want to invest in the green jobs of the future, you're going to need to have steel, and it's an important national resource. But look, whether or not that is the right approach, I want to keep jobs in this country, and whatever the best way to do that is the way I want to do it. But I don't envisage nationalising British Steel now.
Well, let's move on, because as you saw in the headlines, I spoke at length to the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, yesterday. Let's have a listen to that interview. Angela Rayner, thank you very much for joining us here today. And you're here because you've been named as one of the BBC's 100 Women, a list of the most influential and inspirational women from around the world. So congratulations on that. The leader of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, is also on the list. She's also the fourth female leader of her party. Is it high time Labour had a woman in charge?
Well, first of all, we haven't got a vacancy. I'm incredibly proud to be the Deputy Prime Minister. I never thought Angela Rayner on that council estate, in my state school, my career's advice was never going to be projected that I would get to where I am. But I've not done that in isolation. There's been many people that have supported me along the way, men and women. And I think that's the thing for me, is creating the space and often giving people confidence. I think the one thing with women is we often look at the things that we don't think applies to us, for example, on a job description. And we should be saying, actually, I've got so many skills, and pushing and supporting women to come forward.
I mean, Kemi Badenoch said she didn't want much made about her sex and ethnicity. Do you think she's right? It's not that big a deal?
I think it is a big deal, but it doesn't also detract from the skills that a person has. So of course it's a big deal, because I do think that women face barriers, and I think women of colour face barriers as well. So it is important to recognise that, but also that it's not just that who you are, it's about what the substance is to somebody as well.
Well, let's talk about some of the stuff that's being brought to the table by you and others in this Labour government, because it's been a difficult few months, let's put it like that, since you took over in office. Controversy over donations, anger from pensioners, employers and farmers, and on Thursday there's going to be what's widely seen as a relaunch by the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. Does he, as you said to me in an interview a few years ago, need to put some more welly into it, go in with two boots?
Well, I think that Keir's he's really grown as Prime Minister. I think he's taken to the job. He's done a fantastic job internationally, resetting our relationships. He's also set out our missions. Now, the plan for change is about really homing in on what the public can actually tangibly say, well, this is what we expect to see as an outcome from the changes that we've made after the very difficult inheritance that we got when we got in July. And it was really shocking to see the £22 billion black hole, and it's had a real challenge for us to be able to deliver on what we wanted to deliver.
Personality and style, because that's what we talked about last time. And you said, I do think some of Keir Starmer's conditioning from when he was a lawyer and things like that just makes him take the emotion out of it and put the strategic stuff in. Does he need to give it more oomph on Thursday?
But I think the way in which we've all worked, both Keir's style, my style and the rest of the Cabinet, is about how we complement each other. And I think, talking about leadership, I think leaders often have to recognise their skills and the way in which they can deliver, and also their weaknesses and how they can bring a team around them. And I think that's what the Prime Minister is able to do, is bring a team around him and recognise that actually the way in which he approaches a challenge is very forensic, and he goes through it I've described him before as like a civil servant in the way he does it, because he has a duty and he feels that public service duty to deliver for the people.
But does he need a bit more Angela Rayner? A little bit more sort of on delivery, on a bit more style, on a bit sort of upfront in terms of what he's saying and doing?
Do you know, I think that Keir has to lean into who he is, because what's more important, and often people say to me, I don't agree with what Angela Rayner says, but she's got authenticity about who she is. And I think that's Keir. Keir has to be him. And I think the delivery of what he's able to achieve, and look at what he achieved in the Labour Party in 2019. No one would have predicted that we would be in government in July of this year. And he's achieved that. So I would say judge him on his delivery as opposed to
since you've mentioned
what character.
Well, let's talk about the
be.
delivery, because the Labour government, you have made growth the #1 priority. But a dozen recruitment companies have written to your colleague, the Business Secretary, saying that your workers' rights proposals, your employment rights bill, delivers the opposite of this. The government's own analysis has said they will cost business up to £5 billion a year. Is it time for a rethink?
Well, it also talked about the growth benefits for the pro-business, pro-worker approach to the Employment Rights Bill. We've got in this country so many people that are in insecure employment at the moment, very low wages, and that affects productivity if you've got big turnovers. Sure. We've got huge vacancies in some of our...
You've got the biggest companies, recruitment companies, saying that it could put £34 billion of economic activity at risk. I'm just saying, do you think you would have a rethink on it?
Well, I think that there was an imbalance, and we spoke to many businesses. They've been working with us to get the Employment Rights Bill forward.
Can you name a company, a few of them, that have welcomed these proposals?
Well, we've worked with many of the companies.
Name a few.
I've worked with so many of them on this. I've had many roundtables, as has the Business Secretary, and they've very much welcomed the work that we've been doing on making sure that people...
You must be able to name a few, because I can name all the companies, the recruitment companies, Hayes, Manpower, Randstad. They've signed the letter saying this is the wrong approach. You're going to put jobs at risk. Which are the companies that have welcomed your employment rights?
Well, like I say, I've spoke to many companies. We've had many roundtables with them, and we've been discussing it, and they've acknowledged that there has to be a balance and broadly welcomed it. We've made changes as opposed to, for example, on the probation periods when we listened to what business said. So we have the probation periods as well alongside the balance of rights from day one.
Will you get me a list of those companies, and then we can call them and say, do you welcome Angela Rayner's proposal? proposals?
Well, there's been many of the companies that we've worked with, like I say, so many of them.
You have committed as a pledge to build 1.5 million new homes during this Parliament. You are also the Housing Secretary, as well as the Deputy Prime Minister. Almost every single Labour council in England that the BBC has spoken to says that those housing targets are either impossible to achieve or they're unrealistic, or both. Are they wrong?
Well, we set out with the National Planning Policy Framework around mandatory targets. They were set on a rule which was around affordability, and we believe that they can deliver them with local plans. We're working with local councils and mayors to look at how we can deliver the homes that we desperately
almost every
need.
We've spoken to almost every Labour council, including Tameside, the council in your constituency, and they have said they are unrealistic and unachievable. So are you going to force their hand to meet those targets?
We are saying that they're mandatory targets and we want mandatory plans. So we're telling them this is what we expect and we'll work with them to deliver it. The Chancellor announced £500 million extra for the Affordable Homes Programme. We gave more flexibility with that so that we could get social and affordable homes. We've got a housing crisis in this country, and therefore I make no apologies for the mandate that we were given to deliver the homes that people desperately need.
Have you told those councils and those council leaders that
Yes.
that's what they've got to do? So you're not listening to them?
We are listening to them and we've been very clear, and I think those councils will accept as well that this is a real emergency. Many councils at the moment are spending huge sums of money, which is giving them a financial burden on temporary accommodation, on people being in B&Bs. Over 150,000 children are now in temporary accommodation.
I think they understand the problems. It's
problem.
whether they can actually deal with the targets being imposed on them. Last week, there was the first cabinet resignation. The former Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh, quit. And she quit after it emerged she'd pleaded guilty to a fraud offence, now a spent conviction, a decade ago. Do you think she's been treated fairly?
Well, Louise decided to resign, but Louisa did great work while she was in our cabinet, and she's a good friend of mine. I've known her for many years, and what she achieved in the short months that she was in the cabinet was exceptional.
Do you think she should have resigned then? Did you want her to resign?
Well, that was a decision that Louise took, and I respect her decision on that, but I think she was an outstanding member of our cabinet.
So it was her decision, not the Prime Minister's?
Well, she resigned, is my understanding, and the Prime Minister accepted her resignation.
Have you spoken to her? How is she?
I have spoken to her, yeah, and she's fine. She's getting on with the business of supporting the Labour government.
Should she take the £17,000 ministerial golden goodbye, the severance pay?
Well, if that's the severance pay that's offered, then that's a decision for her. And I think that if it's what is the rules and what's said that they're accepting, then I don't see why she shouldn't.
Polls have shown a big fall in Labour support since the election, with the Conservatives ahead in some polls and Reform UK picking up support too. What most worries you, Angela Rayner, the challenge from Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives, or Nigel Farage?
What most worries me in the challenge is delivery, that we deliver, because I've always said it's been an absolute honour and a privilege to be elected to be an MP, let alone become the Deputy Prime Minister. And I feel a very way of you've got to do justice to being there. I don't want to let people down. I've always had that fear. That's what spurs me on. So it's not external forces. I'm my own biggest critic, and I hate losing. So actually I want to achieve those targets no matter how difficult they feel, like the 1.5 million homes target. It is a stretch target, but I'm absolutely determined to, at the end of this Parliament, to be able to hold my head up high and proudly say we give it our best and look at what we achieved, as opposed to the external challenges that we may face.
And on that, when it comes to young people, and you're not that old, but young people today facing high house prices, high taxes, struggling public services, stagnating wages, trying to get jobs and cost of living pressures. If you were a young person now, do you think you'd be able to do what you've achieved?
I think, like I say, it's a challenge, and many Angela Rayners who have done more than I ever did when I was at school face challenges. You have to have a little bit of luck. But what we've put as one of our missions is an opportunity mission. And that means that giving the investment into our state education system, delivering on our mission so that people do have those opportunities that I had. And that's what this government's mission must be about. Because it's not just about individuals. It's about what this country can deliver. And if you don't unlock the potential of everyone, then you miss out on the next person who could have the, discover something that we need. AI, we've been doing amazing work on that. We've got to unlock everyone's potential, otherwise the whole of Great Britain is held back as a result of that. We can't take a chance on not unlocking that potential, because you never know which council estate or which area of the UK that potential is that is going to project our country and nation forward.
Angela Rayner, thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll be speaking to the Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, who is also on that list of inspiring and influential women in the coming weeks. To find out more about this year's list, go to bbc.co.uk 100 Women, and you can follow BBC 100 Women on Facebook and Instagram. Let's get some reaction from our panel, starting with you. Why does the government need a relaunch after 5 months?
That's not what's happening. We're going to do this...
relaunch, reset, whatever you want to call it.
We're going to do this really boring thing, Jo.
Oh,
and I realise that...
don't!
And it's really after, 14 years of chaos and distraction and all these fizzy little changes of policy, we're setting out what we've done in our manifesto, and then we're going to implement it. And this is an update from the Prime Minister on some of the critical things that we're going to do to change people's lives and places like Gateshead.
All right, well, does Labour, Faiza Shaheen, have an issue, or has it had an issue so far with its messaging? They've dropped an average 7 points in the polls since the election. Are they cutting through to voters?
Well, no, I think that data shows that. I think one of the things that has happened is that there's been huge contradictions in what Labour has put forward. So on the one hand, and you saw it there in the interview, absolutely these problems, housing, they kind of get the analysis right to some extent. And then they have plans that are either very weak or contradictory. So you take something like, on the one hand, breakfast clubs in schools, great. On the other hand, they haven't got rid of the two-child benefit cap, right? So they're constantly doing this contradiction. I've heard it said that they've got the foot on the brake and the accelerator at the same time. And you get that on the economy as well, right? You have growth, investment, and then you have this tax on employers, which actually, even as a lefty economist... I was
going to say, I thought you would embrace taxes.
Well, absolutely, taxes in general and wealth, but you wouldn't want to put it on something that undermines the ability for employers to create jobs, because the whole thing is they promise to be, OK, just remember the promise, the highest growth in G7 countries. And they're already in trouble on that. And this is
they're already dropping that, by the way.
Yeah, that's not going to be on Thursday's update.
I'm astonished to hear Pfizer speaking against taxes that will, frankly, fund our National Health Service, fund our schools.
But there's other ways to do things.
It's not going to fund it.
Let Mark respond.
There are always different ways to do this. Politics is always about choices. I sometimes think we've forgotten that in this country. I had to sit in the chamber yesterday and hear Conservatives complaining, using similar language to Pfizer, to be honest, about the changes to national insurance. But I didn't hear any of them talk about what they would do differently to deliver the changes that we need to see in our society. And in places like mine in Gateshead, waiting lists are going through the roof. Kids aren't having the opportunities that they need, and people don't have the houses that they need to live in. It's a huge challenge. Normally, governments come in and they either have a challenge where public services need work or the economy needs work. We've got both, and that's a huge challenge.
What would you do to raise money for public services if you broadly agree that the Conservatives lost the election? Well, you agree with that, but that Labour won it in part because of ailing public services. Where would you raise the money?
Well, I'll tell you what I wouldn't be spending money out on, and this is what the ideology is.
I'm asking you where you would.
No, hang on. GB Energy is a waste of about £8 or £9 billion. On top of that, they're spending more money on foreign aid, which I wouldn't be doing, or on net zero. So they've created their £22 billion black hole by spending on ideologically sort of misplaced ideas.
Ideological to be opposed to net zero.
Hang on a sec. So when you say, of course, you're having to re-kick the Labour Party, you're only a couple of months in, you've had a petition by 3 million of the public saying, you didn't promise us, we never thought we were going to get that.
We had a pretty good petition in July, Esther.
No, equally, this budget has absolutely hammered everybody. So whether that's pensioners with 10 million of them losing winter fuel,
funnily
whether
enough,
it's
no
businesses.
one likes taxes going up, do they? I mean, where would you get the money?
No, I've just said I wouldn't be spending the 22 billion that this government has decided to do.
So you also admit that the Conservatives in the manifesto didn't set out the spending cuts that they would need to make in the way that you have made them in order to fund.
No, hang on. We weren't going to spend that money. We were already bringing taxes down. And by the way, I'm a hang on a sec, a low taxing Conservative. So I didn't like how high it had gone, but it was to pay for COVID and lockdown, and that's what we were doing.
All right, well, Mark, just answer. I mean, can you name, for example, a single business, because Angela Rayner couldn't, that is embracing this workers' rights bill?
I'm not the Deputy Prime Minister, I'm not the Business Secretary, but I speak to businesses in my constituency all the time. And actually, do you know what businesses in my constituency? I was in Low Fell, an important high street in my constituency, only last week, and do you know what they're worried about? High street crime. High street crime.
They're worried about Labour's
worried
budget.
about police cuts under the last government.
They're not. They're worried about what you're doing to their business.
No, there are amazing police force who do an amazing job.
No.
Aren't able to deal with people having the back door of the shops kicked in every night of the week and having takings taken.
25 billion
my next door neighbour has had to spend
My
next door neighbour's had to spend £1,400 on shutters because of low-level retail crime. What would you say to her, Esther?
That's going to be nothing to the bill you've just landed on their business.
£1,400.
I mean,
I'd have said you shouldn't be
Don't all talk over each other because it's difficult to watch. Mark, you answer and I'll come to Emily.
A disaster. You let 5,000 people out of prison. That's what I'd be
Well,
doing.
we'll come on to that in a minute,
I'm
because
more
you
than
have been
happy.
blamed the Conservatives
They blame us for
squarely.
everything.
No,
I'm
by
more
the
than-
National Audit Office for that.
I'm
But answer
more than happy, Esther, to talk about you filling the prisons to bursting point and not building prisons. And I think it's
Three
pretty.
more have been
it's
built and
pretty.
5 are coming online.
Well, clearly not enough, Esther, because this is the thing. Whether it's money or prisoners, you need to make sure that the amount that you want to do matches the amount that you're
Let
planning.
me come to Emily.
Hang on. Thinks two-thirds of people shouldn't be in prison, and that's the problem. The ideology of your prison minister.
Well, I think your departing Justice Secretary also felt that the prisons were too full and they would have to release at least a number
But he didn't do
of.
it, did they?
No, because you lost the election.
No, they didn't do it.
Emily, when it comes to the inheritance, David Cameron and the coalition government spent a lot of time blaming the previous Labour government, quite successfully as it turned out, for the poor economic inheritance. So you can hardly blame this government for doing the same and making decisions on
I'm sorry, Jo, but it's completely different because the Cameron government, I'll tell you now if you let me, the Cameron government made clear when they went into that election, and I think actually it's why they ended up in a coalition, they said we are going to have to raise taxes. They went into an election with a mandate for what they were going to do, so completely different to what Labour have done. They also, I'm sorry, it's not their fault that Labour left them a note saying there's nothing left. And they used that. Why wouldn't they? That was a note left by a Labour minister on his desk. Of course they're going to pick up on that. You don't have a note, and you didn't have a mandate.
You
for
don't
what?
have a note. Is that it? Is that the very best you can do, Emily?
Let me finish. You did not
have
have a mandate for what you just did to business. And I'm sorry, but that budget was catastrophic. Labour know it. Rachel Reeves is now... I mean, I have business people coming up to me, shouting at me about that budget. They are so angry with her. She has shot herself in the foot.
All right.
You have also gone after farmers in this country. You have gone after people who run small businesses, family businesses in this country. They are the very fabric of our communities, and you have gone straight after them.
Right, well, let's talk about... Let's pick up on that. Well, hang on.
Really pay for
Well, let's pick up on that, on inheritance tax changes to farmers, because we have had and heard different voices saying taxes should be fair. Why shouldn't some parts of the community who have been exempt from inheritance tax pay their share?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at wealth inequality in this country, it's massively risen. There's a huge amount of stores of wealth at the top of society, and then huge swathes of the country that has nothing, right? And the problem is actually, and this is what we saw happen, is that because I guess Labour made this decision quite late, they hadn't actually done the work to make the narrative and tell the story about why they needed to increase these wealth taxes. Now, I've worked with governments around the world where they have done that and they've been able to increase wealth taxes in different ways. It is actually, from an economist's point of view, the smart thing to do, rather than, say, tax businesses where you're trying to get growth because you'll be worried about the impact on jobs. So they do need to make an argument about broader increases on taxes on wealth. The problem is because of the backlash now and because they didn't do a good job on pushing out just quite small changes, quite timid changes on wealth, that now they won't do anything else on wealth taxes. And there'll be very few places that Labour can get money from. And they should be going after big corporations, and they should be going after the very wealthiest. And this is, they've started off badly in that regard. And so it's going to be hard for them to raise money. Now, Rachel Reeves is saying, I'm going to not take more taxes from business. Then she had to walk that back. So this is the thing, actually. I think a lot of people will be confused, and that kind of instability of where tax is and if we're going to get taxed more it's not a good thing going into the...
Very, very happy to talk about taxes, but yet again, we're talking about one side of the conversation, which is the taxes, and again, we're not talking about £25.6 billion on the NHS that'll bring waiting lists down. We're not talking about a radical increase in breakfast clubs, which is going to have a huge impact on child poverty. But on the specific point about farmers' tax, whatever you wish to call it, agricultural property relief, etc.
And BPR.
And BPR. And again, I hate talking in acronyms. I apologise to everyone at home. Talk about APR and BPR, but they're two different forms of relief from inheritance tax.
Right, so they're two, yes, different types of relief. OK.
They were introduced by the Conservatives in the 1990s. Fundamentally, what it meant was that if you hand over agricultural land, which some very wealthy people do in this country, to their children, you pay no inheritance tax. None. Zero. Nothing. Right? What
Your
this
tax isn't just hitting just wealthy people. That's the argument.
What this is doing, and I'm not someone who's at risk of paying inheritance tax in my life or in any
because
form.
it only affects a very few households.
It only affects a very small number of very wealthy people, whether that is in assets or whether that is in cash.
Then why didn't you just bring an inheritance tax full in?
Well, inheritance tax.
Can I tell you why you didn't?
Well, actually, Emily, I would quite like.
Let him finish, and I'll
really
come to you.
keen to finish this point because I do think it's important.
Sorry, but you broke into me.
Oh, well, absolutely. It's back and forth, Emily. I'm sure we can have a friendly conversation. Inheritance tax already exists in this country. The inheritance tax exemption, it's not been totally removed, by the way, let's just be clear. Depending on personal circumstances, this could affect people only once you get past £3 million pounds in assets. And at that point, they will pay half as much inheritance tax as everyone else. They'll be able to repay it over 10 years, and they'll pay no interest, zero interest. That is still a huge, huge difference for those who own farms compared to those who own anything else, any other form of business.
I mean...
to be fair, you didn't do the research on it. It was based on miscalculations. Even a Labour tax advisor, Dan Needle, now having looked at the figures, has reversed what he said, and actually you're doing it wrong. You're going to hurt farmers, farming families, and if actually what you wanted to do was try and get those wealthy people who'd invest in land, you should have gone it by a different way. This was all about ideology with no research, and the implementation is going to be shocking. And that is the truth. Now, I'm hoping you're going to backpedal. I'm hoping you're going to increase the amount, as Dan Needle's asking for. But please don't try and justify your mistakes and dig in deeper. Why do you think we're having protests on the streets? And yet again,
well, we had a lot of protests under the last government.
A big mistake on this.
That was not just rich people there. 15,000 farmers. I was on the stage talking to those farmers.
All right.
15,000 people don't gather in the freezing rain. Our teeth were chattering. There were a couple of people out there who were actually passing out, old guys. This was not a bunch of rich landowners collecting there. These were people who literally feel you are threatening their farm. You talk about 3 million. It's
all right, we'll let him come back.
Wrong.
We'll let him come back on it.
You're hitting people whose herd is worth a lot of money, and they are going to have to sell 20% of their farms just to pay a tax which is raising no money. You gave 300 million to who? You are only raising 500 million from this tax. They are begging Rachel Reeves.
They're giving that money to overseas farmers, not protecting our British farmers.
Let Mark respond, because there's been a lot of misunderstanding of the policy also, and there will be people who feel they're going to be hit who won't be hit. But Mark, do you want to respond?
Also invested £5 billion in British farming, but on that point, I have a lot of sympathy for farmers. I have a lot of sympathy for farmers, some who are going to be hit, and also, let's be honest, some who aren't going to be hit, who are being told they're going to be hit.
All right.
But what I will say is we need to invest, if we want to deal with rural crime, if we want to make sure we have more buses in rural areas, if we want to keep the rural pharmacy open, we're going to have to raise tax revenues, and that means everyone's going to have to play their part.
Let's have a look inside the chamber, because it's filling up, of course. We have just over 10 minutes until Prime Minister's questions with Sir Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch. Let me just show you this tweet from Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform UK. It says, last night I told the Spectator Awards there would be hundreds of reform newcomers in Parliament before long. The look on Wes Streeting's face, the Health Secretary, says it all, and we can show you that image from last night, and you can see Wes Streeting there behind Nigel Farage as he goes up to collect his award. Esther, do you think there are going to be hundreds of reform MPs in a future Parliament?
I don't, actually. But I am always impressed with the BBC's fascination about this reform versus the Conservatives, which we also had
at the BBC's fascination.
which we had at the general election, and what you saw, the 5 reform MPs, 21
So you're not worried about the threat from reform?
What I think the Conservatives have to do, which I am, would say, be more conservative. Just
what does that mean?
Well, that's we've got to get back to a low tax, low state, tough on crime, tough on immigration.
And what would you stop the government doing if you want to have a smaller state? What should the government stop doing?
Stop expanding with its quangos, stop taxing, stop trying to take over responsibilities it can't do. That's a start. There's stop going into, whether it's net zero, handing money abroad, many
You want
things.
it to be smaller than it is now. You're talking about not expanding. You want it to be smaller than it is now. What should the government stop doing that it does currently?
It's rapid expansion, whether that is quangos,
that's expansion.
whether that's...
You want it to be smaller, so it has to cut something. What is it?
And I would say go back to the core things that we need to develop on and deliver on that a government needs. And I would look at things. Obviously, we've got to have NHS, we've got to have police, we've got to do things as well as we possibly can. But what we don't want is this rapid expansion, what we're getting now. But let's go back to what I wanted to say, and this is the fascination between the BBC does have with reform and the Conservative Party.
Well,
and
indulge me then. Indulge that fascination for a moment then.
What we didn't do at the general election was look at what Labour was going to deliver as the party of government. It never did that. And it's got a fascination, which it's got, again, about what's going to happen in 4 years' time.
You lost the election and you lost it very badly. Do you think the party has really reflected on that defeat, the scale of that defeat?
Yes,
you
it
didn't.
Has.
You
Yes,
think
it has, and it will take some time to do that.
Quick.
And that is
That was a
exactly
quick reflection.
No. And this is why Kemi has said what we're going to do is what are our fundamental principles.
What should the immigration cap be then? She hasn't said what it should be. What do you think it should be?
If I was going to do an immigration cap, I would actually say at the moment a moratorium on anybody coming into the country. So I'm there because I think we've had so many people.
So the same as Reform UK, net zero.
Country. Well, I don't know where
net
there
zero
are, but
immigration.
of course we have to do that. We have to look at the numbers of people coming into the country that are already here in the country, that we've got to house, put through schooling, look at the health system.
So you wouldn't take any more refugees if there was another war, like Ukraine?
Look, we've always had support for people in need. But as I said, at the moment, I would look at a very, very tight target because we cannot carry on allowing people in, particularly illegal immigrants in the number that are coming into this country.
Pfizer?
Can I just say, I think the reform, I mean, I'd worry about hundreds of reform MPs, but I can see where that's coming from because there's a strong sense of anti-establishment voting. I found that in my own seat. I had people say they were going to vote for reform, but when I went independent, they were going to vote for me. And I couldn't understand it because, policy-wise, I'm complete opposite, right? And it's because they are fed up of a two-party system. I haven't been on this show for 5 years, and honestly, I just was reflecting it's hard work listening to this, right? And people feel that at home, and they feel that people don't speak to their needs. Mass despondency, only 52% of voting age adults voted in this election. And that's the concern. And I think it's not just the Conservatives, actually, it's Labour as well. Reform is second in 80 of Labour seats. And I think one of the things I really worry about is when I see Keir Starmer walking over to Nigel Farage and laughing with him, and the sort of language that we hear on immigration from Keir Starmer is that there's no one, or there's very few voices in our political system now that represent the opposite to what reforms stand for. Right. Everyone is playing into it.
Let Mark respond. How worried are you by the threat?
Oh, I think there should be no complacency from any political party about reform or any other of the more radical elements within our politics. Look, there were a lot of people voted reform across the country. There were thousands of people voted reform in Gateshead. And, I said to them before and I said to them after the election, I understand why you did. You feel like politics has let you down because for over a decade you were told that government doesn't do anything, governments are always bad, no positive change can be delivered for you. And I'll tell you what, take a walk around some parts of my constituency and you see public service workers working incredibly hard. You see people struggling to try and keep their businesses afloat. And you can understand why, in this climate, people feel like you need a change. But what this government's going to do, as I said before, we're going to deliver for people. And by engaging in that delivery, we'll go back to people, we'll say, we made these promises, we kept them. Government, when it is done well, works. And that's how we'll earn the trust of the British people.
What do you say in response to Pfizer commenting on the language around immigration? Do you think that needs to change?
I think that what we need is a serious discussion about immigration. I think we need to cool the conversation about immigration. I think it is far too easy for people to get, on both sides of the debate, to get incredibly agitated, quite rightly, because this is about people's lives. I think we need to talk far more respectfully about those who come to this country, quite often in very difficult circumstances. Quite often I feel like we talk about them in general. I say we, in society, we can talk about them quite disgracefully. But also I think we need to talk far more respectfully about and to the communities that are affected by that immigration as well. And too often, again, in politics, we do one and we don't do the other.
That sounds like nothing then, Mark. What you're going to do?
Well, look, Robert Jenrick, one of your colleagues, referred
backed Robert Jenrick for the leadership.
Absolutely. Then I presume you agree that it was a day of shame for the Conservative Party when the immigration figures came out last week. Nearly
906,000 in net migration.
Way too high, and that's why Rishi Sunak did cut significantly the number of dependents who could come in the country, and that's where we'll see them filter through. But was it too many people coming into the country? Absolutely it was. And that was the numbers and the speed with which they're coming in, and equally the illegal immigration. And that's why we needed the Rwanda bill. And I think it was desperately, a big mistake, and it'll prove to be a big mistake that Labour has got rid of that. As Germany now looks to do it, as other countries look for third countries. No, you've made a major mistake.
But do you want to own the fact that you had the highest level of net migration at 906,000, despite saying you were going to cut it?
No, we do have to own that, of course we do. And I'm saying that we do want that, and that's why I said I personally would look to a moratorium for the time being as we look to house, home, accommodate and see what we've got with the people who are already in this country.
Can I just make one brief point about Farage? I think Farage is in a very strong position at the moment, and I was at the Spectator dinner last night, and I think Labour are looking incredibly nervous, as they should, and I had long chats with Labour people at my table.
And the Conservatives?
Conservatives also will be nervous, because Farage is great at exploiting problems, but what both parties need to come at him back is that he's very, very poor at solving them. And I can tell you that immigration is a classic example of this. His latest solution to immigration is, and I quote him exactly, dump them back in France. Well, it's simply not doable. That might work across social media, but the two historical parties, which are Labour and the Conservatives, they have a history of actually fixing solutions. The trouble is they really need to come up with credible solutions.
As you mentioned that,
Rwanda was a credible solution that now Labour.
Well, we don't know because it was never tried.
Immigration, economy, the numbers don't add up.
Just to say, we did ask Reform exactly that question about pushbacks, and that it's not possible with France not agreeing to it or signing up to it. Just very briefly, Andrew R.T. Davis has resigned, in part because of what's going on politically in Wales. He is the leader, Conservative leader in the Senedd, and there was a Conservative wipeout in the general election. How worried are you about diminishing support in Wales?
Well, I don't think this is going to look like a good set of results for us coming forward, and that's why I say the Conservative Party do, under Kemi, and they will, under Kemi, get back to our fundamental beliefs. And I've always said, because I'm a traditional Conservative, let's get back to our traditional Conservative values. And at the moment, Reform, we're trying to steal our clothes. We have to own that space and then day by day come forward with the solutions which we are. And Labour, as I said, the budget was the start of the collapse of Labour.
Well, I don't know about that as yet, but that's what you are saying. Let's talk about something completely different, but it has been in the news a lot over the last week or so, and that's about the MasterChef presenter Greg Wallace, series of allegations of inappropriate behaviour made against him. And now the Labour MP, Rachel Taylor, has said that she wants to see all the episodes of MasterChef pulled. The BBC has agreed it's going to pull the MasterChef Christmas special. Should all episodes be pulled, Mark?
Oh, Rachel's a good colleague, and I respect people feel very strongly about this. That, for me, is a matter for the BBC. What is far more important for me is that we have a conversation about sexual harassment more broadly across society, because I think if we pretend that this is a matter purely for the BBC and not for other workplaces, we're missing an opportunity here.
Right, you've worked in the industry, Esther. I mean, the culture in the media, film, TV industry, I mean, yes, it was a while ago, but do you think it's improved in any way?
Well, I think we need to find out what actually did Greg do wrong. It seemed to me he was inappropriate, he was crude, he was naff, but none of these ladies seemed to say they felt they were in any threat. They didn't think that he was sort of perving
So that makes it okay?
It's not. But what I'm saying is, let's get this into context and into proportion. And I do smile at the Labour Party with its double standards on this. John McDonnell, back in 2014, said I should be lynched and unleashed absolute danger to sort of my existence. And I did not see any female Labour MP come out for the protection of what a Labour MP had said. So let's get to the bottom of
Do you think this has been overplayed?
For what I'm seeing
I'm going to have to
in
interrupt
the
you. I'm so sorry.
far, yes, I do.
All
and
right,
I think the
let's go
BBC
to PMQs.
These two members playing up. That is absolutely disgraceful for the member. We've started PMQs. Either come in early or at least wait. Please start reading the room. Ian Room.
Question number 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to welcome His Highness the Emir of the State of Qatar to the UK, and I look forward to discussions this afternoon on how we're strengthening our relationship and boosting trade and investment, including the announcement today of a £1 billion investment in our new clean energy partnership. Mr. Speaker, Sunday marked World AIDS Day, and we stand with all those that we have lost and those living with HIV today, and we will seek to end new cases of HIV in England by 2030. Mr. Speaker, can I also note that we're joined in the gallery today by Mandy Damari, mother of Emily, a British citizen still being held hostage in Gaza. I've met Mandy a number of times, and in my view, what she's going through is nothing short of torture. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
In room.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to concur with the comments the Prime Minister has just made. North Devon District Hospital is the most remotest hospital in mainland England. Its intensive care unit has only 6 beds, and it's almost 50 years old, and it serves a population of 165,000 people. Can the Prime Minister assure my constituents that their hospital will receive the urgent funding that it's needed under the new hospital programme, so that they will not face over a 2-hour drive to the nearest trauma unit?
Mr. Speaker, the new hospital programme that we inherited was emblematic of the failures of the previous government, making promises with no plan to deliver on them. We are committed to delivery, including the North Devon Hospital. We're reviewing the programme to place it on a sustainable footing, and the Health Secretary will set out further details of the new delivery soon. And in the meantime, we continue to support trusts to develop their schemes. Thank you.
Olivia Bailey.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the swift and decisive action this government is taking to secure our borders after the party opposite lost control? After the party opposite lost control, Mr. Speaker. And in particular, can I welcome the world-first deal struck with Iraq last week to tackle smuggling gangs? Does the Prime Minister agree with me that international cooperation, shared intelligence and joint law enforcement is the best way to end the vile smuggling trade.
I thank my honourable friend. She's a superb champion for her constituents. And she's absolutely right. The previous government left a broken asylum system. We put a plan in place, the Border Security Command, backed by £150 million, 100 more NCA officers, and we're introducing counter-terrorist style powers. And my friend is right that our new international coordination, including the landmark Iraqi agreement. And the hard graft is already beginning to pay off, because 9,400 people who've no right to be here have been returned. That's a 30% increase on the numbers of last year. They promised to get the flights off the ground. We've got them off the ground.
We come to the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Bailey.
Mr. Speaker, if I may, I would like to pay tribute to Mandy Damari and her family for the strength that they have shown. And we on this side of the House, and I'm sure the whole House, continue to seek the speedy release of Emily Damari and the other hostages. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister talks about immigration. I think it's probably a good time to remind him that he was the one writing letters asking us not to deport foreign criminals. And he and his party voted against every single measure that we put in place to try and limit immigration. But, Mr. Speaker, the question today is what has been on the lips of all Labour MPs, including, I believe, the Health Secretary yesterday. The Prime Minister knowingly appointed a convicted fraudster to be his Transport Secretary. What was he thinking?
Mr. Speaker, the previous Transport Secretary was right when further information came forward to resign. What a marked contrast to behaviour in the last 14 years. And she talks about immigration, record levels of immigration under the previous government, nearly 1 million net, and she was the cheerleader. She was the one urging on the removal of the caps for work visas. She was thanking the previous Home Secretary for the work that was done. She championed it, she advocated it. Record numbers of immigration.
Mr. Speaker, he's obfuscating, but I'm going to keep him on the topic. He owes the House an explanation. He said that the former Transport Secretary was only asked to resign after further information came to light. What was that further information?
I'm not going to disclose private conversations. Further information came to light. The Justice Secretary resigned. As I say, what a marked contrast. But whilst she's obsessing with the Westminster issues, we're getting on with fixing the mess, fixing the foundations, that £22 billion black hole, our prisons bursting, and Mr. Speaker, as we found out last week, nearly 1 million net migration numbers because of the Tory open borders policy.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not asking about migration. I'm asking about the former Transport Secretary. He never answers any questions. He never answers any questions. And it looks like he didn't ask his Transport Secretary any questions either. The truth is, he appointed a person convicted of fraud to the Cabinet. The first thing she did was bung hundreds of millions of pounds in pay rises to her trade union friends. Wasn't this a fraud on the British people?
No, Mr. Speaker, she says she's not talking about immigration. I'm not surprised. And I advise her and all of them not to talk about the economy or immigration for another 5 years.
Mr. Speaker, he can try and change the topic as much as he likes, but the public are watching. He owes them an explanation. The country needs conviction politicians, not politicians with convictions. Now on to an even bigger fraud. Now on to an even bigger fraud, the budget. Last week, the Prime Minister failed to repeat the Chancellor's pledge of no more borrowing and no more taxes. It is obvious that they are coming back for more. In his manifesto, he committed to making Britain the fastest growing economy in the G7. Does he stand by his own pledge?
Mr. Speaker, I gently remind her that 2 of her predecessors had convictions for breaking the COVID rules. I'd also invite her to look at the OECD report of this morning, which has upgraded growth for next year and the year after, which now puts us on target to be the highest growing major economy in Europe in the next 2 years. She should welcome that.
Mr. Speaker, I saw the OECD report, and what it said was that they will be coming back for more taxes. And I think the whole House would have heard him fail to repeat his own pledge. He can't even repeat the pledges that he made just a few weeks ago. We are here to stop him from damaging the economy, and that is why we are
I want to hear the question. Can we burn up?
Mr. Speaker, they are laughing the same way they all laughed during the budget when they talked about raising NI. They have no idea what people out there are dealing with. And that is why yesterday we voted against his damaging jobs tax. Even former supporters, Chef Tom Carriage, who endorsed Labour at the election, said that the budget was catastrophic. He built a real business employing young people, unlike his cabinet of trade union stooges, CV embellishers, and an actual fraudster. None of them have ever run a business. Why won't he listen to business who are saying his budget is catastrophic?
Mr. Speaker, I thought the scripted jokes were over, but we had another one about lectures about the economy from the party opposite. They broke the economy, mortgages through the roof, and a £22 billion black hole. And she talks about national insurance. She complains about the rise in national insurance week after week. But then 2 weeks ago, she says that she wouldn't reverse it. She signed trade deals, Mr. Speaker, that had farmers protesting in Whitehall. Now she pretends that she's their champion. She campaigned to remove the cap on migrant worker visas, and now she pretends she's furious about the open borders policy of the last government.
Mr. Speaker, the fact is the Prime Minister has discarded his own Labour leadership promises. He's dropped the 5 missions he said would define his government. He's ditched his pledge to make Britain the fastest growing economy in the G7. We left office with UK the fastest growing economy in the G7. And business is saying he has damaged the economy with his budget. Tomorrow he's going to have an emergency reset, Mr. Speaker, just 5 months into his premiership. But why should anyone believe a word he says?
Mr. Speaker, the only relaunch on that side of the House is the leadership bids of her rivals. And she obviously hasn't read the OECD report of this morning, the fastest growth in the next 2 years of any major economy in Europe. We're proud of that. And they should never be allowed to forget the damage they did to our country. They used Britain like some sort of mad scientist experiment. Open borders, unfunded tax cuts, neglected health service. And now, all the madness is still coming out. They say they should be back in office. They haven't listened, they haven't learned, and they certainly haven't changed. There's only one party that's driving this country forward, and that's this Labour government.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, question 3, but who knows, next week I could be #1 in the charts. As the first MP this year to bring out a Christmas single, will the Prime Minister join me in thanking my musical collaborator, the hugely talented Mal Pope, and everyone involved with this year's Everyone Deserves hamper campaign that would deliver festive food to 1,500 homes across 5 constituencies in South Wales. Like our song says, there's a reason for the season, and everyone deserves a Christmas.
Well, I thank her for her question. There's obviously going to be some rivalry in the race for #1 by Christmas. I'm not going to be joining in that particular one. But I do thank her and Mal Pope for their campaigning. And I remember joining her in the summer, a few summers ago, on the work involving hampers, much needed by her constituents. And I know how much it means to them. Christmas is a time to think of others. And I do pay tribute to her and all those supporting those in need. And this government will always support the most vulnerable in our society. Thank you.
Here are the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I, for one, will be downloading the song of the Honourable Lady for Neath and Swansea East. Can I join the Prime Minister in his delight and also his support for Mandy Damari, and our joint hope that we will see Emily and other hostages released as soon as possible. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has rightly spoken about the need to restore and rebuild the public's trust in British politics. Now, we believe a crucial part of that is reforming our electoral system to make it fairer and more proportional. And so does a majority of the British public. And this House voted yesterday in favour of a bill for electoral reform put forward by my honourable friend, the member for Richmond Park. So will the Prime Minister find government time, make it available, so we can consider this bill on electoral reform and restore the public's trust in our politics?
Can I thank him for referencing Emily, because I think it is important that we all remember her, and I say the awful torture that her mother is going through, and that's the case for all of the other hostages. It's hard to imagine what it must be like for anybody with friends and family who are still being held hostage after all this time. Look, proportional representation is not our policy. We won't be making time for it. And I just gently say to him, he didn't do too badly under the system as it is.
Right, David. Well, I'm disappointed in that reply and hope he will reflect on Labour's own policy. But moving on to another pressing subject, Mr. Speaker, more than 3 million people have been stuck on NHS waiting lists for more than 18 weeks. That's probably the worst, most appalling legacy of the last Conservative government, and it needs to be fixed. But does the Prime Minister accept that we'll only get waiting lists down and keep them down if it's easier for everyone to see a GP when they need it? So when he publishes his milestones tomorrow, will he include a guarantee with a timetable so people will be able to see a GP within at least 7 days or 24 hours if it's urgent?
Yeah. Well, he's right to draw attention to the record of last government on the NHS. Record waiting lists and record low confidence in the NHS. So in addition to the economy and immigration, they better not be talking about that for the next 5 years either. We will be driving this down. We've already begun that work to make sure we get those waiting lists down. And yes, of course, that does also include making sure there's better access to GPs and other measures that need to be taken. But that's a central driving mission of this government. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that a significant number of members in this place are, regardless of class, women of a certain age, would the Prime Minister agree with me that when a woman of a certain age, or indeed any woman of any age from any background, says they have experienced sexual harassment or inappropriate behaviour, they should be listened to, supported and the perpetrator dealt with?
I certainly agree with that, and I think everybody across the House would. She's right, because, Mr. Speaker, one of the greatest barriers that women face when coming forward and reporting unacceptable behaviour in the workplace is having confidence that they will be taken seriously, and that requires all of us to put in place mechanisms and arrangements to make that possible. Everybody should be treated with dignity and respect, and I'm proud of the fact that the Employment Rights Bill that we're passing will strengthen protections from sexual harassment at work.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Friday the 13th is a date associated with bad things happening. Next Friday, the European Union's General Product Safety Regulations will apply in Northern Ireland, creating more costs and bureaucracy for English, Scottish and Welsh companies who want to do business in Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland consumers buying from them. Many businesses have already stopped supplying Northern Ireland. Haulage companies are unsure what is required of them. Online sales platforms are divided on the advice that they give. Mr. Speaker, a previous Prime Minister promised Northern Ireland businesses that if they were asked to complete additional paperwork, they should phone the Prime Minister and he would direct them to throw the form in the bin. What direct, tangible advice can the Prime Minister give to those businesses who want to continue supplying Northern Ireland?
Well, I thank him for that question. It is a serious issue, and the government is working closely with businesses to ensure that they are ready for the changes that he has identified, and we published more guidance, as he knows, yesterday to support them further. We will be keeping a close eye on the issue to help businesses trade freely across the whole of the United Kingdom. Thank you.
David Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Stoke-on-Trent and Kidsgrove, we are proud of our beautiful historic buildings. However, many lay dormant and blight our proud towns. Can the Prime Minister please outline what steps this government is taking to bring historic buildings back into use, and will he make time to visit my constituency to see for himself our untapped potential?
Well, I thank him for raising this issue and certainly consider his kind invitation. Mr. Speaker, we will invest in heritage buildings, restoring pride, ensuring they serve the needs of local communities. The National Lottery Heritage Fund has awarded Stoke-on-Trent £250,000 to help preserve the city's heritage. Historic England is also funding emergency repairs at the iconic Wedgwood Institute and supporting Reform Heritage, whose office, I think, is based in my honourable friend's constituency, to employ staff dedicated to delivering heritage projects.
Pete Wishart.
Speaker, today is the Scottish Budget, and inside it you will find provisions to reinstate the winter fuel payment to all of Scottish pensioners, something that he, of course, famously took away from nearly all of the UK pensioners, supported by Scottish Labour members of Parliament. But apparently, Scottish Labour are now in favour of winter fuel payments. So what's his advice to Labour MSPs? Is it to vote for the budget to ensure that Scottish pensioners get that single fuel payment, or is it to stick with his view and vote that budget down?
My advice to my team is to ensure the SNP are absolutely clear. We have given them the biggest settlement to Scotland this year under our budget. They now have the powers, they have the resources, they've got no more excuses for the failure to deliver.
Clive Efford.
Speaker, a year ago today, this House defeated the then government over the contaminated blood scandal compensation scheme. This government's £11.8 billion set aside for that compensation scheme is welcome. But as victims die every week, there is concern about the pace of payments and the fact that rules are being changed behind closed doors in Whitehall without explanation, contradicting some of the recommendations of Sir Brian Langstaff. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that next week's meeting scheduled with the campaign groups representing the victims must represent the start of those infected and affected being involved in the process that they fought so hard for so long and too many died and failed to see?
Mr. Speaker, we are committed to acting on the findings of the infected blood inquiry and ensuring swift resolution and compensating in full. And that's why we announced £11.8 billion to compensate those who waited far too long for justice. And I'll happily make sure that he gets a meeting with the Paymaster General to discuss the issues he's raised.
Jo Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everyday pensioners in my Leicester South constituency are emailing me with one word, and that word is frightened. Susan, who has pulmonary fibrosis, wrote, "During winter, I rarely go out as it is too cold for my lungs. I need to keep warm and I need to keep my heating on. The winter fuel payment was really, really helpful." She writes, "I want MPs to know that not all pensioners are millionaires or receive gifts from millionaires, nor do we all get the higher rate of pension. Susan is frightened. She won't be able to keep her house warm this winter, and she is not alone. Does the Prime Minister realise how frightening it is for the 8,100 pensioners in my constituency who have lost their winter fuel payment fuel payment help? As the winter month starts to bite, will the Prime Minister come to Leicester to explain to Susan why he thinks this policy is not frightening?" Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, as he knows, the #1 job of this government was to get our finances back in order after the mess that the last government made, including leaving a £22 billion black hole. We had to take tough choices. They say they want the benefits, but they can't say how they're going to pay for them. We do want to make sure that the most vulnerable pensioners do get the pension credit that they're entitled to. We're driving that up. But because we're stabilising the economy, we can commit to the triple lock That's a £460 uplift in the pension next year, so every pensioner will be better off under a Labour government.
Andrew Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Middlewich Eastern Bypass will support the delivery of nearly 2,000 new homes, 6,500 jobs and 1.5 million square feet of employment land. The previous government, having first promised to fund it, dragged their feet, putting jobs and investment at risk. Mr. Speaker, we're approaching the season of goodwill. So can the Prime Minister give my constituents an early Christmas present and offer some certainty over this vital infrastructure project?
Mr. Speaker, we are committed to supporting drivers across the country, including by freezing fuel duty and investing £1.6 billion to maintain our roads. That's £500 million more than the previous year. I do know his constituents have waited years for certainty on this scheme. The project is currently going through an assessment and government process, and I'll make sure that he gets a meeting with the Roads Minister to discuss that.
Martin Wrigley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The major GP practice groups in my Newton Abbot constituency have written to me detailing their precarious finances. Planning for the year ahead, they're considering their options, including redundancies, handing back their contracts or bankruptcy, and they've stopped recruitment of GPs, resulting in fewer patient appointments. The Health Secretary has promised an increased funding allocation, but has yet to say when we will know how much this will be. Will the Prime Minister release this funding information and meet with me and the GPs to hear their precious first-hand?
Mr. Speaker, he's right to raise this. The Darzi report that we commissioned made clear that the NHS was broken by the previous government, and that's why we provided £22 billion of additional funding in the budget this year to start the work fixing our NHS. We do obviously value the vital work of GPs, and every year, as he knows, we consult with the sector about the services that they provide and the money they're entitled to in return. And we'll send that out. We will set that out in the usual way.
Thanks, McIntyre.
Mr. Speaker, Holly Gazzard was murdered by her boyfriend outside her workplace in Gloucester 10 years ago. Since then, her family have established the Holly Gazzard Trust, which educates young people on domestic abuse and stalking and keeps women safe with its Hollyguard app. Will the Prime Minister join me in paying tribute to Holly's family and the work of the Holly Gazzard Trust? And will he update the House on the steps that this government is taking to tackle violence against women and girls?
Mr. Speaker, a decade on, the thoughts, I'm sure, of the whole House remain with Holly's family and friends, and I do join him in commending the vital work of the Holly Gazzard Trust. In relation to the steps we're taking, we've got a mission to halve the levels of violence against women and girls within a decade. That is really tough to do. Nobody has ever committed to that before. I invite everybody across the House to join us in that. And that will include, amongst the steps we're taking, placing domestic abuse experts in 999 control rooms to make sure they're picked up early, launching a pilot of new domestic abuse protection orders, developing a national framework to track and target high-harm offenders, and strengthening stalking prevention orders. We will take other measures to make good on this commitment.
Graham Ledbetter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A WASPy woman dies every 13 minutes. That's 2 since the Prime Minister took to the dispatch box today. That's 111 every day and nearly 17,000 since he took office. So can I ask the Prime Minister, how many more WASPy women have to die before the government takes action to give them the financial redress and the justice that they are due?
Mr. Speaker, we are moving at pace on all relevant issues. We've passed the budget to provide the baseline for what we need, and we'll continue to do so.
Yuan Yang.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Local councils in my constituency of Earley and Woodley are facing significant financial pressures from SEND provision. Woking Borough, for example, has twice the level of SEND instance than the national average, yet historically the level of funding has not met the level of need, and this has left families and children waiting too long for help. The previous government's safety valve programme was only a sticking plaster, so I welcome this government's announcement today of additional SEND funding in mainstream schools. What more can this government do to make SEND funding sustainable?
I'm grateful to her for raising this. I think the 5th or 6th time SEND has been raised at PMQs. We did inherit a system neglected to the point of crisis by the last government, and so we'll deliver the change that's desperately needed. That means increased funding to the core schools budget by £2.3 billion, includes almost £1 billion more on high needs budgets. And today we're investing and announcing investment of £740 million in funding to create SEN units in mainstream schools which deliver specialist support, and I'm very pleased to be able to take that forward.
Kieran Miller.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, members across this House are deeply concerned that the Post Office are considering closing more than 100 branches across our communities. More than 3,000 people have signed a petition opposing the closure of Bexhill Post Office. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the government must ensure we protect vital post office services for all of our constituents?
Can I thank him for his question, and can I also recognise the campaigning of many, including himself, for local services that their constituents rely on. The Post Office is required to maintain a network of 11,500 branches and ensure that 99% of the UK population lives within 3 miles of a post office. Decisions, obviously, about individual branches are for the Post Office to take, following consultation with local communities, but I'm happy to make sure he gets a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss his particular case.
Speaker, in my constituency of Darlington, it's full steam ahead to 2025, when our town celebrate the 200-year anniversary of the railways with a 9-month festival. We're proud of our industrial contribution, but many in my area have concerns about the future of our rail industry. What assurances can the PM offer that he will get our railways back on track?
Mr. Speaker, we are delivering on our commitment to bring railways back under public ownership, putting passengers first. And today we've announced that South Western Railway services will be the first to transfer into public ownership next year. So we can turn the page on decades of delay, fragmentation and failure.
Kirsty Blackman.
Much, Mr. Speaker. Veteran Anne Puckridge is also in the gallery, and can I urge the Prime Minister to meet her to talk about her frozen pension? Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Daily Record reported that Scottish Labour MPs are very upset. Apparently this upset is caused by their Scottish leaders' diktat that they now have to support the very winter fuel payment that they voted against in this place. As the Prime Minister comforts his upset MPs, will he remind him that the only people with the right to be upset are the 900,000 Scottish pensioners who were left in the cold by Labour's cuts?
I work very closely with Scottish Labour in a harmonious way. We ran a fantastic campaign earlier this year, which is why she's sitting up there and not down here.
Leon Coleman.
Can I echo the words across the House in relation to Mandy Damari, who I also met with this week and is from Beckenham? Yesterday marked International Day of Persons with Disabilities, and I'm proud to be one of the disabled MPs in this House. As a sixth former, I became one of the youngest people in Britain to have a hip replacement, and I relied on a blue badge. Data released yesterday shows blue badge theft has more than quadrupled in the past 10 years. Will the Prime Minister back my campaign to tackle blue badge theft and ensure millions of disabled people can work, socialise and live an independent life?
Can I thank him for being a powerful voice for some of the most vulnerable in our society? Look, theft of a blue badge is appalling, depriving people of their independence and ability to travel with confidence. It has a real human impact every single time, and that's why we're working closely with local authorities to help them tackle fraud and misuse. And I'll make sure he has a meeting with the relevant minister to examine what more can be done.
Chris Stafford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following on from the question from the member for Aberdeen North, in the gallery today is Anne Puckridge, who is a World War II veteran and an intense campaigner. She's flown over 5,000 miles from Canada to meet the Prime Minister to discuss the frozen pensions, a policy denying her and 500,000 Brits who live abroad a frozen pension. I'm sure Anne won't mind me saying that she will be 100 years old in a couple of days' time. Would the Prime Minister reconsider his decision, give Anne the best birthday present ever, and meet with her to discuss this issue?
Well, I'm grateful to him for raising this issue. I think he will well know and understand that our position is in fact a continuation of the position under the last government.
Richard Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister share my concern that the report by Audit Scotland finding the Scottish Government has no clear plan for the NHS in Scotland? As a Scottish Labour MP, I'm delighted this government is providing £4.9 billion extra for public services in Scotland. Isn't it time for the SNP ministers to get a grip and do better for patients in my constituency who are facing some of the longest waiting times for surgery in Scotland?
Well, I'm grateful to him for raising this because waiting lists in Scotland are appalling. And that's why we make the argument. They now have the money, they've got the resources, no more excuses for poor delivery.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
Yes, that's the end of this week's Prime Minister's Questions, as you heard there from the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle. Let's introduce our guest for this part of Politics Live for the Government, Jo Stevens, the Welsh Secretary, Harriet Baldwin for the Conservative Shadow Business Minister, and the BBC's political correspondent, Jo Pike. Welcome to all of you. Well, it was a pretty lively PMQs in terms of the exchanges between the Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, asking the questions and very much going on the attack, certainly on issues around the economy and on tax. But before that, she asked the Prime Minister about the now former Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh. Jo, what did we learn, or did we learn anything new following the fact that she has quit? Now it's become clear that she pleaded guilty to a fraud offence a decade ago. It's now a spent conviction. Did we learn anything?
Well, we learned two things. One, I think that Kemi Badenoch wants to make the most of a resignation that happened, Jo, almost a week ago, a decision taken by Keir Starmer and Louise Haigh last Thursday night, announced on Friday morning. So Kemi Badenoch, in this sort of bullish, quite playful mood, wanting to bring that back and make the most of it, make them sort of exaggerate the awkwardness, I suppose, for the Prime Minister and the Labour Party. But in terms of Keir Starmer's answers, we learnt that he doesn't really want to get involved. And the key question is, what was the further information he found out that made him decide to ask Louise Haigh to go? Because we know that she declared this when she was appointed to the Shadow Cabinet a few years ago. So she told Keir Starmer about it. He was aware about this conditional discharge she was given by a magistrate. She didn't put it, we're told, on the form you have to fill in when you become a minister from the Propriety and Ethics team. And maybe there was some further information that Keir Starmer had found, but effectively, I suppose, him and his aides, Jo, had sort of killed this story by moving very, very quickly, short-circuiting almost a process that could have been dragged out day after day if Louise Haigh had remained in post. Interestingly, Kemi Badenoch choosing punchy language, saying the PM knowingly appointed a convicted fraudster and then tried to bring this to some of her work in the Transport Ministry, saying paying train drivers, giving them a pay increase was in itself a fraud on the British people.
Jo Stevens, does it matter that Louise Haigh had a previous conviction, a spent conviction, for a fraud offence?
Well, first of all, I'm very sad that Louise Haigh has resigned as a Cabinet Minister. I think she's a very talented politician and I'm sure that she will have more to offer in the future and she'll work, as she has done throughout her time in Parliament, for her constituents in Sheffield Heeley. I think she made a decision. She did not want to be a distraction to the government. She's a team player and she decided to go, and I respect that decision.
Right. Should that prohibit you, though, from entering into government?
Well, it's a spent conviction. You know, as the point was made in Prime Minister's questions, both the previous Prime Ministers from the Conservative Party had convictions themselves in relation to breaking COVID rules. And we saw a whole series of very serious issues during previous governments where two Conservative MPs were jailed for sexual offences. So, you know, and that's whilst they were MPs. They were not spent convictions. They were convicted whilst they were MPs.
I mean, isn't there a level of hypocrisy here, Harriet Baldwin? It's true, the Prime Minister had said in the past, as Leader of the Opposition, that law breakers shouldn't be law makers, referring to what Jo Stevens was saying about Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak and those fixed penalty notices. So why and to what value, apart from political advantage, is there about saying that the Prime Minister has taken on a convicted fraudster?
Are you implying that Keir Starmer is being a bit hypocritical about this, because that's quite possible, isn't it? Because he was very, very tough on these issues when he was leader of the opposition.
But that's because they happened. That's because they happened when Boris
knowingly...
Johnson and Rishi Sunak were actually in office.
Yeah, but this seems to be a situation where the Prime Minister, informing his cabinet, has knowingly appointed someone to that cabinet who has a conviction, and someone who's got a £30 billion budget in government. And then it seems to me we didn't get a clear answer at all from him today. He said these conversations are private. The only thing that had changed was that it had been reported in the media. And he knew it, but he won't explain what had changed. And I think that was what Kemi Badenoch was trying to get at
Do you think someone with a spent conviction shouldn't be able to stand for public office like an MP or come into government?
Actually, I don't think that. I think that there should be redemption. Of course there should be. What I think is interesting, though, is that clearly she was appointed with the Prime Minister knowing that, in full knowledge, and then something changed. The only thing that changed was that it became public knowledge and it made him look like a hypocrite.
Right, should we know what that further information that came to light that informed the Prime Minister and made him accept the resignation of Louise Haigh?
I don't know what the conversations were.
No, but should we know? Should we know?
And I think the Prime Minister was right to say that those are private conversations. And there's a lot of assumptions that Harriet has just made. I'm not going to make assumptions because I wasn't party to those discussions. Louise decided that she would leave the cabinet. She did that because she didn't want to be a distraction. And I think that was probably the right decision for her.
Right.
But, I hope to see her back in the future. She's a very talented politician who in just 5 months has delivered a huge amount for the country in terms of transport.
And just to be clear, Harriet, you don't think it should preclude someone standing for office as an MP or in the government? You disagree with Kemi Badenoch?
I think that it happened a long, long time ago. If we ruled out of political careers everyone who has got something in their youth that, you know, but the issue here was that he knew about it. He appointed her to a big budget, and then he asked her to leave government.
You're not suggesting that she has done anything fraudulent in relation to that budget, are you? I hope you're not.
I'm making the point that he knowingly appointed her to that position, and something has obviously happened, and the only thing I can see that's happened is that it's become public knowledge and made him, you know, look embarrassed and shifty, and having, you know, gone so hard on this in opposition, he just didn't want to stand by her.
But you agree there's nothing fraudulent about giving train drivers a pay rise?
Well, I think that's a whole other issue that we could spend a lot of time on. I think that it was a very big mistake for her to give the pay rises without any request for reforms, you know, for passengers, the benefit of passengers.
And there had been a strike going on for a significant period of time that had cost the British taxpayer a lot of money, caused a lot of problems on the rail network, cost the economy, and she resolved that dispute
still a lot
within
of problems on the rail
days
network
of coming
with
into office.
Drivers not showing up for work, a lot of cancellations.
Jo?
And it's maybe worth knowing, I was told by someone in government that Keir Starmer was quite frustrated that after that pay deal, he found out through a BBC push alert, a BBC News alert to his phone, that further strikes were possible. So it's certainly true. Another sort of element of all of this is that the Prime Minister seemed to be, over a number of months, frustrated. There's also the P&O comments that Louise Haigh made, and certainly her allies argue that she was a bit of a misfit, and that maybe Keir Starmer and his allies wanted her gone anyway.
Right. What do you make of those comments, that she was pushed out? She was a sort of member of the awkward squad. Her comments about P&O ferries ahead of the investment conference is perhaps what marked her card.
I think it's political gossip. You know, I don't think there's fact in that, not that I'm aware of. All I know is that Louise did a very good job as Transport Secretary, and I was very sorry to see her go.
Let's talk about the continuing fallout from the budget and tax, because Rachel Reeves made quite a claim to the CBI conference, because businesses are still reeling from the £25 billion worth of tax rises in terms of national insurance contributions going up for employers. And she said, I won't be coming back for more tax or more borrowing. What's happened since then?
I think, Jo, the Parliament, the government's position has slightly evolved but remains unclear. Keir Starmer refused at various points to repeat what Rachel Reeves has said to the
including last
CBI.
week at PMQs.
Exactly, at PMQs. Yesterday at Treasury Questions, which was maybe a bit of a moment of jeopardy for the Chancellor, with a bit of a backlash, certainly from opposition parties. She failed to repeat it. And, of course, the Conservatives have been arguing that the government lacks a stable message for businesses. But there was a bit of clarity yesterday from the Chancellor at a conference in Hull for Northern business leaders. At that conference, she said, I'm not going to be coming back with another load of tax rises or indeed higher borrowing, arguing, some would argue perhaps fairly, that she can't make a budget for 5 years' time. I think trying to say, we've done the biggest, worst, most serious, most controversial things now, And so if we do things later, it'll be lesser, but certainly not ruling out anything at any point in the future.
Are tax rises on business ruled out for the rest of this Parliament?
I'm not the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Rachel Reeves was very clear.
Well, she wasn't. That's the whole point.
No, Rachel Reeves was very clear. We came into government with a plan. We had to make decisions on discovering that £22 billion black hole, which we didn't want to have to make. But she's been clear that that first budget that we've had is a very big budget.
Yes.
It fixes, the mess that we've been left with. And she's not intending to have another budget of that size in the future.
Right, so she's being slightly less clear than she was originally at the CBI conference when she says, I am not coming back for more tax and more borrowing in this Parliament. Now she's saying she's not intending to do it, so you can't say that she's ruled it out. She could come back for more taxes on business or otherwise, or more borrowing.
What she has said is she's not going to write the next 5 years of budgets in the first 5 months, and I think that's a perfectly sensible
So was it a slip of the tongue to say that she would rule it out?
I don't know, you'd have to talk to Rachel about that, but she's very clear that, she's not going to write the budgets for the next 5 years in the first 5 months of being the Chancellor.
Well, there you go, Harriet.
Well, it's actually worse than that, isn't it? Because if you think back to the general election campaign, Rachel Reeves repeatedly said that she wanted to rule out any tax rises on working people. And then we had this budget that suddenly came along that over the next 5 years, the Office for Budget Responsibility says is a £360 billion increase in public spending, financed by the biggest tax rises in history, and additional borrowing. And it is a massive shock to businesses. And you can see that in some of the statistics that we've had this week, some of the leading indicators from organisations like the Institute
So
of
why
Directors
isn't Kemi Baden not saying she's going to reverse?
Absolutely.
Why don't the Conservatives say, we will pledge to reverse those national insurance increases on business?
Because I think the approach that Kemi Badenoch is taking is that the election is not tomorrow. That what is important here is to look at this Chancellor who has been unable to say on the record in Hansard to Parliament that she's ruling out the things that she is promising outside Parliament to the Confederation of British Industry and so on and so forth.
In Parliament, and it's in Hansard, that she wants the benefits of the budget, but she's not going to explain how she would ever pay for them.
Well, I'd love to know what the benefits are of this budget. Because the budget so far
NHS,
seems
extra
to be
investment in transport, extra investment to grow the economy. Bearing in mind the legacy that your party left at the election in July, and I'm astonished that...
the legacy was that the economy was growing faster than any other economy in the G7 for
having stagnated for year after year after year, having had the economy crash as a result of Liz
it's convenient,
Truss's
I know, for you to forget that there was a pandemic, to forget that Putin invaded Ukraine and caused energy prices to go through the roof.
Liz Truss's budget. People are living with the legacy of that every day.
You're repeating that without acknowledging the measures that Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak took to completely unwind those measures and bring the economy back to where it was growing when you guys took over. And unfortunately, this budget has had such a devastating impact in terms of business confidence that it's not going to achieve the single most important mission that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor told us was their objective, which is growth.
Right.
And it's very, very concerning to see that, and that's why businesses are so
the
worried.
OECD report published today, which says that we will be, they will increase the rate of growth. We will be increasing the rate of growth. You don't accept that?
Well, I'd much rather trust the actual businesses in the United Kingdom that I have sat down with who tell me that they are putting investment on hold, they are potentially reducing jobs, and the Office for Budget Responsibility, which says that the budget itself reduced the rate of growth of the economy.
We'll come on to the OECD forecast in just a moment. Do you regret, Jo Stephens, in any way, the language that has been used by the government during the campaign, where there was this pledge? We don't need to argue about the semantics, but there was a pledge that said you wouldn't put taxes up on working people. There are these £25 billion worth of increases in national insurance contributions coming from employers. And now we have a bit of toing and froing about whether Rachel Reeves will come back for more taxes. She may have to. She can't write those budgets. That has had a big political fallout. Do you accept that?
I don't accept that, no, because we went into the election with our manifesto based on what we knew at the time about the economy. If we hadn't discovered that there was an in-year black hole of £22 billion, there were decisions in that budget that we would not have had to take.
Although the OBR, just to be clear, has only really said £9 billion was unaccounted for. But generally, I'm talking about the
I know, but on the desks of
let me ask you a different question.
before
Are you
the election
surprised
that they did not
about the backlash from businesses that you had courted, that the Chancellor Rachel Reeves had wooed in the run-up to the election and during the campaign, that there is so much fury about the changes on tax, on inheritance tax, on businesses and farms?
I spoke last week at the CBI dinner in Wales, an annual event, and that's not what I heard from the people in the room. Hundreds of businesses in the room about the budget. What they want to see is political stability, economic stability, so they can have the confidence to invest and make decisions, because they haven't had that for the last few years. And they share in our aim, our number one mission for economic growth.
Right, you say it's the number one mission. I've interviewed the Deputy Prime Minister, your colleague Angela Rayner, about her employer rights bill, employment rights bill, I should say, and she couldn't name one business that has embraced that piece of legislation. Can you name a business? You've just talked about them in Wales. Who is backing that bill?
So there are consultations underway about various aspects of the employment rights bill. But what we have, after a promise of many years, I mean, your government, Harriet, over a number of years promised an increase in employment rights and protections.
I still haven't heard you name a business, Jo.
No, you didn't do anything to increase employment rights and protections. Why
can't you name a business? I don't understand. Why can't you or Angela Rayner, you've met all these businesses, who are they that are embracing your changes?
I can tell you one business because I used to run it, which is Thompson's Solicitors. So,
great, OK.
A UK-wide business employing an awful lot of people. But, what this bill is designed to do is to protect people at work and to raise the floor, because we know there are people across the economy being exploited through arrangements, that they, the power relationship, there is no equality there. This bill is designed to lift that floor. It's not going after good businesses, of which there are lots and lots across the country. People who manage and lead their businesses well and treat their employees properly.
All right.
This is to raise the floor.
Well, let Harriet respond. What's wrong with that?
I just genuinely do not think that this Labour cabinet, where they have really very little business experience themselves,
I used to run a business, Harriet.
Very little. I said very little, Jo.
With a huge turnover.
I said very little, Jo. And the majority of the cabinet have very little business experience, and that they have run themselves into a situation where they are going for the businesses that are the engine of the growth that, yes, everybody wants. And we're not also hearing today about the other organisations like charities, like hospices, like GP surgeries, who are all suffering from this increase that came out of the blue, that they were promised they would not get in the election campaign.
Well, Jo, do you want to respond to that point
charities,
specifically?
Hospices, GP practices, all businesses need a good, healthy workforce. They rely on hospitals and the NHS to have a good, healthy workforce. We need investment in our public services because of the austerity of the last Conservative governments. So we've got to invest in the NHS. We need to invest in transport so people can get to work and have reliable transport to do
Should there be exemptions for those? Charities, hospices, in terms of paying those higher rates of national insurance
The decision has been made in the budget and there's not going to be a change.
Right, so no exemptions at all.
And the Office for Budget Responsibility themselves say that people will shed jobs as a result of this. When you have a jobs tax, people will cut the number of jobs. And what I have had happen in my local hospice is they are actually reducing the number of nurses. And I just think it's completely counterproductive, and they really ought to exempt organisations like those.
How much heat do you think the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is under over this ongoing fallout from the budget?
I think she's under a lot of pressure, but I suppose, Jo, this is governing for you. It's also interesting that if we look at what's happening tomorrow with the Prime Minister making a big speech about his new 6 milestones, that some previous promises are not there.
Right, including make Britain the fastest growing economy in the G7. Growth is the first priority. Why is that not going to be mentioned as one of the milestones tomorrow?
Well, we haven't seen the milestones yet.
No, we know that that is not going to be included, which is part of the original 5 pledges from the Prime Minister.
The missions we set out in the manifesto, that's what we were elected on with a substantial mandate, and that is what we'll deliver. And so the milestones that are being set out tomorrow are those further steps along the line during the course of this Parliament, so that the public will be able to measure what we do against what we promised. You know, this is about being transparent and honest with the public, which we've not had under previous governments. So here's what you elected us on, here's what we said we'd do, this is how we're going to do it, this is how you can tell whether or not we're delivering it.
Well, let's have a look at this headline. I said we would talk about the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. The Times has UK economy. OECD raises growth forecast for next year. Are you pleased?
Well, to be fair, that is exactly what the Office for Budget Responsibility says as well. But what they then show is that the rate of growth drops away after you have that sort of sugar rush of the increased public spending in years 1 and years 2. And you're also going to have this experience of a lot of private sector jobs that will reduce their hiring, or they will cut the number of people they employ, because this is a jobs tax.
Right. I mean, do you think, in terms of all your plans, they are predicated on higher growth? And they were anaemic, those forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility.
But that's, you know, that was on the basis of this year's budget. That's not the limit of our ambition, you know. So we have announced huge amounts of investment, which will be matched through the National Wealth Fund by private investment. You know, all the stuff that we're going to do around renewable energy, floating offshore wind, solar, onshore wind, all of those steps will create jobs, will create economic growth, and we will crowd in investors. And we've seen from the International Investment Summit, £63 billion of investment promised. Way more than Conservative governments achieved.
Because otherwise they'll have to be spending cuts, and spending cuts that neither manifesto in the election campaign spelt out, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, said both manifestos were a fiction in that case. Do you admit that there would have had to be very severe spending cuts, Harriet Baldwin, in order not to have raised the taxes that Labour have?
Actually, what Jeremy Hunt put in his last budget was inflation plus 1%. That was what was baked into the last budget that Jeremy Hunt did. But we were more ambitious in terms of welfare reforms. We thought that there was more that we could do there. We were more ambitious in terms of asking for increased productivity from some of the public services. So, for example, we increased NHS budgets by 45% in the last Parliament, but productivity in the NHS in terms of the number of operations was still back at 2019 levels. So there was more that we thought we could get, probably £20 billion worth of additional productivity gains from the NHS.
I want to... Yes, Jo, did you want to say something? No. I wanted to raise another issue before the programme ends about the MasterChef presenter Greg Wallace. We talked about it briefly before PMQs, and it was raised indirectly by a question from a Labour MP in this week's session. Greg Wallace has been accused of inappropriate behaviour. There are allegations that he has strongly denied. Lawyers acting on his behalf have said he strongly denies it, and he is engaged in behaviour of a sexually harassing nature. But he hasn't responded to latest allegations that have emerged overnight. Now, there's been a call from a Labour MP, Rachel Taylor, who sits on the Women and Equalities Committee, saying that every series or episode of the MasterChef series should be pulled. Do you agree with her, Jo?
I'm not sure I do, actually. I respect, you know, that's Rachel's view. I'm not really sure, but then, I don't spend a lot of my time watching MasterChef. OK, so you don't think this is the right thing to do. The BBC has pulled the Christmas edition. What's your thought on it, Harriet? Well, I mean, I don't watch MasterChef either, but I think we should call it masterclass in how not to manage a PR crisis. If you look at the way that Greg Wallace actually behaved and insulted his core audience in terms of how he reacted initially. But, you know, clearly this is a matter for the BBC to decide, and it's not something I watch anyway, so whether they pull it or not, I'm not really particularly bothered.
And I think there's obviously an investigation underway. These are allegations. The production company is handling the investigation. I think we just need to wait to see what comes out of that.
Well, and as I said, his lawyers have strongly denied he has or engages in that sort of behaviour. Just briefly, headlines for tomorrow's relaunch, reset, update, I've heard it called.
I think it's going to be a big moment for Keir Starmer. There's a lot of pressure on him to deliver something that is passionate, exciting, that is going to, for his MPs, excite their potential voters next time around. There have been Labour MPs who are saying privately that the last few months have been difficult, that Keir Starmer hasn't necessarily led as all of them have wanted to. And even though his allies say that this is not a reset, they've been working on this all summer, there does seem to be some pressure on him to deliver something that is inspiring, that Labour MPs can get behind and campaign behind in their constituencies.
Thank you very much. It's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me for this part of Politics Live. I will be back tomorrow with more at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. From all of us here, bye-bye.